Okay, well, just quickly about me. I haven't always lived in the UN bubble. I worked in industry for many years. I was based in Australia. I'm not from Australia, I'm a New Zealander. That's a very important distinction. So there I was involved in the early stages of the development of land-based carbon project origination more than 15 years ago now, and worked as an auditor under the government scheme there, and then worked in carbon certification, assurance and risk management frameworks throughout Asia, Middle East and Africa. And for the last 7 years I've worked at the United Nations in helping peacekeeping operations become more sustainable. And hopefully from this presentation you'll see why that's the most interesting part of the UN to work in from my perspective. So thanks for having me. So I'll just talk about the UN a little bit, just give you some context, what we're doing and where we're going. Well, no doubt you're pretty familiar with what the UN is. You always think of the General Assembly and the Secretary General and the various agencies, funds and programs that make up the United Nations. It's actually a very complicated bureaucratic system. I think maybe more so than Mitsubishi, but I'm not so sure after hearing your discussion. So there's various what they call organs of the UN, agencies, funds and programs, and we're effectively a big civil service that is working on behalf of the member states, the countries of the world that also fund the United Nations. But many of those agencies have completely separate mandates, reasons for living, and different accountability structures. So they effectively have boards of the member states run by an executive officer. So it's quite a complex system. So I do want to point out at the start that I'm not speaking on behalf of the United Nations. Really only one person can do that. That's the Secretary General. All the different agencies all work together in what's called the UN system, which is quite complex, as I say. Okay, so looking at the UN system in terms of its footprint, the one on the left here is what we call the UN system, which is kind of a club. The borders of the UN system are only roughly defined. But the big block here is what's called the UN Secretariat. So that's the entity that hosts the Security Council, the General Assembly, and various other funds and programs. So a program might be the United Nations Environment Program, the World Food Program. They are situated within the Secretariat. Okay, and I'll explain why that's the biggest piece in a second. So we emit about 1.5 million tons per annum, CO2 equivalent. It's big. It's bigger than some countries in the EU, but it's smaller than many corporations and many countries. And as I'll explain later, a lot of that comes from our peacekeeping operations, and we're much, much smaller than the carbon budget of the world's militaries. Okay, so we've got various agencies. Sorry, WFP is a separate fund outside the UN Secretariat. So that has a big footprint that's transporting food to those in need. UNHCR provides it's the High Commission for Refugees, so refugee services. UNICEF's another big one. UNDP is involved in development, so invests in infrastructure in least developed countries. So they're the sort of big UN agencies that I'm sure you're familiar with. And then I mostly focus on the peacekeeping operations. So out of the Secretariat, this is pretty much to scale. The darker blue patches are the individual peacekeeping operations around the world. So this is the 2022 footprint. This one up here is MINUSMA, so one of the biggest peacekeeping missions in Mali, which we closed very rapidly last year. So that footprint is made up of air travel, vehicle travel, and generation of our own power. And each agency has a very different footprint. You have some agencies of a few dozen people organizing conferences for thousands of delegates. So their footprint per capita for commercial aviation is massive and makes no sense in comparing them with another agency that generates its own power like we do. So roughly half of the global footprint is in air travel. In most agencies, that's commercial aviation, booking flights to go places. In peacekeeping operations, and particularly WFP, we run our own aircraft, so that's scope 1, our own fuel, and that's quite a significant component of the footprint. And then in facilities, it's the standard purchase of electricity as well as generation of electricity. And again, in peacekeeping, that's pretty much diesel-powered generators distributed across hundreds and hundreds of locations throughout the world. But I'll go into a bit more detail later. Okay. All right, so I wanted to interlace this discussion with the questions for my roundtable that you can come and help me with. One in particular is the setting of KPIs and benchmarks we find very difficult. We're not Coca-Cola. We don't make liters of Coca-Cola or dollars of revenue. We're here to serve people, and we use people as our sort of our KPI denominator. And that's really problematic depending on the way the organization is set up, like I said before, for some of the agencies. The other issue we have is benchmarking. Peacekeeping is a very fluid operation. It goes up and down, so it's very difficult to compare across years if you don't have these proper KPIs in place. And then on the Scope 3 side, it's even more difficult. Agencies like Office of Project Services might be developing hydro dams for countries in one year, landfills for another, and that just changes year by year. So that's a very difficult area for us. There's one. Okay, so a little bit more about peacekeeping. This is from 2019, so I guess it's heyday when we had lots of operations throughout the world. 15 peacekeeping missions, and that's 131 personnel. And that's mostly made up of the uniformed components. So that's countries providing their armies, military personnel, and their materiel to the peacekeeping mission. So about 120,000 of that are troops on the ground in the familiar blue helmets. And that has an operating budget of about $6 billion US, and at that time, our spend on fuel was $300 to $400 million US a year. So throughout the world, mostly in Africa, we had a mission in Haiti that closed and looks like may need to open again. We've now closed Mali, as I said. UNAMID in Darfur has closed and may need to open again. And so our biggest footprint at the moment is now the Republic of Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, and South Sudan. Okay, and then we have political missions which are not militarized and they're often co-located. So in Somalia, we have a quite unusual mission in that we support the African Union to provide troops, and then we have a political mission associated with that. And then obviously the Middle East is another area we're quite prominent. Okay, so what does peacekeeping look like? It looks sort of like this. It's usually a collection of outposts, militarized with a security perimeter, and we're operating in countries that are conflict affected, so usually have degraded utility access. So we're effectively completely off-grid. There's no electricity grid, there's no water provision, and there's no one to take our waste in most cases. Obviously, it differs by mission. We have missions in Kosovo, Cyprus, Lebanon, which are a bit different, but by and large, they're completely self-sufficient. So there's, well, at the heyday, there was 500 of these locations. Now we're down to about 400. They take a battalion of troops, either 200 or 400 uniformed personnel. And the more remote you get, the more heavily reliant we are on the uniform components. So they, in many cases, will bring their own generators, and there's a big political process about how we negotiate how we pay for those generators. That's based on generator capacity, not efficiency, and we provide the fuel. So there's a whole political economy as to how we generate electricity out in the remote locations. So primarily diesel-powered electricity production. The footprint of renewables between 1% and 3% when we first started work on this topic. And then we source our own water, usually from water bores, occasionally from surface waters. Treat our own water, which has been problematic in the past, and you're probably aware of some of the issues historically that peacekeeping has had. And part of the environmental strategy that I work on is to make sure some of those issues never arise again. And then we deal with our own waste. So I'm chairing the circular economy session, and that's very important for us because it comes out to literally Timbuktu and can't go anywhere from there. So reverse logistics, reducing the amount that's coming into the peacekeeping mission is very important to us. Okay, so what are we doing? Well, there's a lot of work on data, performance management, and what really struck me in working in the UN is building a sense of community of practice around what we're doing. So literally we'll have an environmental person in Timbuktu that doesn't get to talk to other people in their profession very easily. So establishing that network of best practice has been a really important feature. And then on the technical side, it's relatively straightforward stuff that I'm sure you're all aware of. Generating efficiency of the generators is probably our biggest opportunity to reduce emissions. It's the biggest quick win we have, and we've done a lot of work in that space. Obviously, the deployment of renewables, more efficient air conditioning equipment, lighting, metering of our water, energy, and waste generation. Solar power of our pumping systems, more efficient fixtures, and then segregation and treatment of waste. Now, most of these locations, there is no opportunity for recycling unless we do it ourselves. So by and large, we're deploying very fit-for-purpose incineration technologies. So some of the wins, the air conditioning systems that we now deploy are 30% more efficient than they were in 2017. The accommodation units are mostly prefabricated unit structures, and they are now 30% more efficient, and the water fixtures are 30% more efficient as well. Okay, so what we've achieved. Let's go. So there's a lot of information. I'm going to leave 3 references if I've broken the microphone. Sorry. Okay, a very busy slide. I'll provide references if you're interested in what we've been doing. So here's our greenhouse gas footprint of around, wrong button, around 1 million tons up here and distributed through the various missions. So the big ones, South Sudan, Lebanon, Mali, Central African Republic, Congo, and there you see UNAMID rapidly dropping as it was drawn down to 0. This is our proportion of renewable energy, which has crept up from 3% to now 7%. That's a mixture of on-site generation and connecting to grids. So in MONUSCO, there's a lot of renewable power actually, so our investments there are in connecting to those grids. But our actual share on a site basis is quite high. So small deployments of small systems to many sites, and they're both are creeping upwards. Now, the member states really care about our fuel use because that's what they pay for. And that's coming down. But it's very difficult analytically to demonstrate the impact because it's a mixture of drawdown of the emissions, closure of emissions, and being more efficient. And you might think, oh, but you can have a KPI value that works that out on, say, a per capita basis. But actually, when you draw down a very highly diesel-powered mission, then the residual goes up in terms of its renewable energy just from closing that other site. So it's actually a lot harder to determine the true impact of our work with this big fluctuation in operational footprint. Okay, so on the water side, this is our main focus. So managing the risks to the local population of improper treatment of our wastewater. So we're in highly fragile communities who access their drinking water from surface waters, and our main priority is to be making sure that those systems treat the water efficiently and we don't get any repeats of discharges to local communities, and that's been very successful. A couple of other highlights. I can't operate this thing. Here we go. Improved disposal methods. So the deployment of best practice incineration has taken off. We now treat more than half of our waste through incineration. Prior to that, it was literally dumped at local, not even municipal sites, so dumping sites. So that's been a big change, is to treat that in-house. Obviously, we do composting, recycling where possible, and so on, but incineration is really the only answer for many of these sites. So that's reduced the waste to land disposal and the risks of disposal at multiple sites. Okay, so we've been working under the auspices of a environmental strategy since 2017 that lasted until 2023, and on the requests of member states, that has been extended to 2030. It's a continuation of the approach. Which in summary is not drop the ball on managing our risks, and particularly those that can impact the local community, accelerating the use of renewables and increasing our ambition in relation to that, and to provide an infrastructure legacy. So the traditional, these are all temporary deployments under the mandates of the Security Council, and the member states who fund peacekeeping missions want to get their best bang for buck in terms of dollars spent. They actually want to see us recoup the value of those temporary deployments as much as possible. So there's two issues with that. One is we're not leaving adequate infrastructure for the local people. They're designed to be temporary and relatively cheap. Yes, so that's an area that we're working on. Now, in terms of renewables, there's clearly an incentive to deploy them more rapidly. The cost to payback ratio is quite attractive, but still beyond the 1 to 2 year window of a peacekeeping operation. So in the views of the member states, they're temporary. They may not be renewed. They're renewed on an annual basis. So there's no way to know how long those operations are going to be there. Now, the fact is the average is 10 years, and we've had peace operations in the Middle East since the 60s, but the view is they're temporary. So making the business case for enhanced renewables is sometimes problematic, and the funding is problematic too. So there is intense pressure on peacekeeping operations to reduce their operational spend. And that operational spend is mostly flowing back to the member states who contribute troops. So more than half of the budget goes back to that use of equipment and personnel. And then you have all the civilian overhead costs and so on. So the engineering budgets are very small, and they're really the only flex budget that we have. So it's very, very difficult for the missions. And for the whole UN system, it's a difficult problem as well, because for every dollar you spend on renewables, you could be spending that on vaccines or schools or other things that the UN is mandated to do. So we're making good progress, but it is quite difficult. Okay, so you've talked about the risks. So I guess linking it back to some of the discussions we had this morning, for us, the key focus on the renewable side is working with others to provide us renewable energy. The model now is to look at what vendors can come in and establish systems for us to use so that we can pay them for that investment, and then that can be leveraged for local communities both while we're there and afterwards. Now that's quite a difficult task in some of these countries, but we've had a couple of good models already. In Somalia, we've just commissioned a big system there run by a private operator. We have 2 sites in Central African Republic that are currently out to bid, and we'll be working on that. Now, that introduces some complexities around renewable energy certificate markets. So anyone who has an interest or knowledge about REC markets, I'd love you to come to our table a bit later. There's a lot of complexities there that we need to unpick. Yeah, so then back to the positive infrastructure legacy. Our view is that by leveraging partnerships, so those market mechanisms, commercial relationships, and relationships with the host country and host communities, give us a better chance to set up facilities that meet the long-term aspirations of the host communities. One lesson we learned from the management of wastewater risks was we invested, I think it was around $200 million in very good high technology equipment using membrane treatment systems, and deployed them around virtually all sites in the peacekeeping operations. We couldn't hand them over to the local communities. They were energy intensive. The membranes cost $40,000 a year, and there was risks of us leaving them there for them to be operated improperly and create more issues. So the focus now is to think about the infrastructure that we deploy in terms of how it's fit for purpose for that local community. One success story in that space was in Mali, where we worked with a local wastewater authority and invested in their facility. So used our engineering expertise, our resources to build a better facility for them to treat our wastewater and leverage that for the treatment of their own systems. Okay, so as I said, I can't speak on behalf of the UN, but if you're interested in the UN's view on net zero, I encourage you to be familiar with the report issued, I think it was a couple of years ago, from the Secretary General's high-level expert group on net zero claims. If you're interested in sustainability in the UN, there's a publicly accessible page called Greening the Blue, and that looks at sustainability in all UN operations and provides the annual report on our footprint as well as our initiatives. And then the review of the environment strategy for peacekeeping operations was released early this year. So that highlights what we've done in peacekeeping over the last 6 years. And then there's a companion document about the way forward, but that's got the results and the numbers in terms of all the work that we've been doing. That's it from me. As I said, I'm here to learn from industry, and I'd be grateful to discuss some of these topics in more detail with you at the roundtable discussions. Thank you.